Hello everyone, I'm Deepak Kashyap. I welcome you all to TheDaak's 33rd Baithak. TheDaak began as a book review journal in 2023, and over the years we have published book reviews, commentaries, and research essays across various themes. TheDaak Baithak is our attempt to bring diverse conversations in social sciences to our audience. Our speaker today is Dr. Panchali Ray, and her talk is titled Fluid Rivers, Fixed Borders, Alienation in the Hydrosocial World of Bengal's Chars. Doctor Panchali Ray is an associate professor of anthropology and gender studies at Kriya University. She earned her PhD in gender studies from Jadavpur University, where she previously served as faculty at the School of Women's Studies. Dr. Ray has authored a book titled Politics of Precarity on Gender and Healthcare Labor, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2019, and edited Women Speak Nation, which was published with Routledge in 2020, and Teaching/Writing Resistance, Women's Studies in Contemporary Times, published in 2024. Her research traverses gender, caste, labor, ecology, borders, and nationalism. Her current ethnographic project explores how right-wing nationalism transforms solidarity and citizenship among Dalit and Muslim farming communities in Bengal's Char borderlands. Her talk today explores the lived experience of alienation among Muslim Char dwellers in fluid, riverine borderlands of Bengal. She draws on her ethnographic fieldwork and examines how state-driven securitization and documentary regime disrupt the hydrosocial rhythms of life shaped by erosion, sedimentation, and mobility. Her talk will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A session. Our today's discussant is Dr. Raina Ghosh. Dr. Raina Ghosh is a human geographer with expertise in urban political ecology, water-society relations, and urban spatial politics. She holds a PhD in geography from JNU and has recently started her Urban Studies Foundation International Fellowship at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I would now like to request Dr. Ray to please begin her talk. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I really wish to express my gratitude for being invited at your forum. It's really a pleasure to speak here. And without much ado, I would like to speak on my research. So what I would like to present is some of my findings and my understanding of my fieldwork, which I have been doing since the end of 2021. So I've been going and living in these chores, which are also called riverine lands, in the borders of India, Bangladesh, in Bengal, in Murshidabad district. So I draw my research and my talk. I draw my talk from my ethnographic findings. So just to give a context of the space that I work in, the geopolitical space that I work in, is or rather, let me first begin by explaining what a chore is. So basically, if you and they're very well researched area. Chores are sandbanks that emerge and submerge as the river moves, as it accretes and erodes, and Eastern India, or rather the whole India-Bangladesh delta, the Bengal basin as it was historically known, is actually a fluid region. It is a region where the Ganga, Brahmaputra rivers are constantly eroding. It is a region that defies all kinds of understanding and binaries of land and water. So my research is based on Bengal in the India-Bangladesh border. The village that I work in is called Nirmalchar, and it is in Murshidabad district. So I went there trying to understand what river erosion does and what is and just to give a little more quick context, that there was a Farakka barrage that was built and that was operational from the late 1980s, 90s, and that led to massive erosion in that area. And when I started my research there, I went with all the curiosity of understanding what what these large-scale development projects, what they brought into the lives of riverine communities, or what in Bangla we call choruas or chor dwellers, those who live with the chors. But as much as we go with our own understanding, and one of the things of being an ethnographer or an anthropologist is that you completely change your research when you go there. So I remember one of the first times I was there, and I was trying to have a conversation with my host, rather his wife Shaya, who I write about. And so I was sitting there trying to take fieldwork notes, and I was asking her, and she was narrating all the multiple times, the 15 or the 20 times that they had to build and rebuild their homes because of erosion and the movement of river. But she would speak with so much of nonchalance that after a point I was trying to kind of prod her into telling me more about the vexation that the river caused her. And she just looked at me and with this very sympathetic understanding that really you don't know much. And she said, in Bangla, she said that nodir opor obhiman kara jay, which means can one grudge a river? If there is a river, there will be erosion. And it kind of led me to start thinking about the symbiotic coexistence of river and riverine dwellers, and why we, with our understanding of ecological crisis and climate change, try to peg people in certain categories and how people defy those categories. So the understanding that I went with was one of, say, injustice or dispossession. The understanding that I started developing is what is of an uneasy coexistence. Is not necessarily a happy or a harmonious coexistence, but not necessarily one of misery or deprivation either. It is a way of living in which rivers and humans and non-humans live together. But today I'm going to more talk about the other point that I want to make before I go is this fieldwork was also at literally on the India-Bangladesh border. And as I went to understand hydraulic infrastructure and devastation, etc. But without wanting it, the border started becoming overwhelming in my research. And one of the reasons, and that's when I started thinking of how does one understand borders and rivers in these kind of fluid landscapes which defy any kind of territorial sovereignty. So river moves, border moves. How does one understand this? And how does one try to understand what kind of hydrosocial life worlds do people live when they live with the border and the river? And then I started, for me, and this is the paper that I shared with you and which I want to talk about. For me, I started it became a question of alienation more than a question of injustice or dispossession. Of course, all of that is there. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying for me to figure out how the river border and how riverine communities navigate both, it was the alienating aspect that started taking on an overwhelmingly informed my research. So the fundamental question that I asked in that paper and I want to talk about is that how is this newly emerging infrastructure of surveillance, as we understand it, and we are seeing that is being unrolled, particularly the last 6 months, 1 year has been very, very volatile with all kinds of electoral campaigns happening and the electoral voters list being revised, etc. This infrastructure of surveillance, this kind of citizenship regimes, the kind of emphasis more on the documentary regime that is emerging. How does this sit with people whose land beneath their feet is constantly moving? How does this kind of sedentariness, where you have to show that the land that you're standing on is firm and you belong there, how does one understand this with the life worlds of people who are constantly moving? So Choruas, or chor dwellers, or riverine communities move with the river. So as the river moves, sandbanks emerge and they submerge. So these chors can be in existence for a few weeks, maybe months, or for decades, and they can become thickly human population, like thick settlements can emerge. So overnight, as the river moves, Choruas move from one chor to another, stake land, build their homes, stay there. wait for another erosion to happen before they move again. So this kind of a, and it's a circular migration. Despite it being in an Indo-Bangladesh border, really the migration is peripatetic and circular. It is moving with the river. So they don't acknowledge the boundaries or the borders. For them, territorial sovereignty doesn't matter. What matters is the rhythm of the river. And this is what, it's been so much of research on shores and rivers. And what has now become very popular is the idea of amphibious anthropology, where you question static understanding of land, water, of lives, of mobility, of movement, or sedentariness. The amphibious part being very, I think, very important when we are trying to understand riverine communities, when we are trying to understand liminality, or the, what should I say, the inconsistency of land and water, and the lives of those who live with this kind of sand, silt, water, etc. And in this whole amphibious anthropology, the concept that really kind of spoke to me was the idea of a hydrosocial, the hydrosocial life world, which is not seeing sociality as an add-on to an already existing hydrological infrastructure, as if there is a hydraulics there and how do people build around it, but to see how lives are lived in hydrological ways. So how people move in hydrological ways, flows and rhythms, how they relate to each other, which is which you is very, it's not deterministic, but the kind of subjectivity that is very receptive to nature, that moves in rhythms of the nature rather than really seeing it as a cause effect or in a deterministic mode, because that's the kind of critique that comes when you try to talk about life worlds, or when you try to talk about hydrosociality, that is it deterministic. I don't think it's as deterministic as much as it's to understand life as something that is flowing, that is rhythmic, that does not necessarily move in cause and effect manner, that does not move in a certain linear manner. So the rhythms of the lives of the delta, for instance, how is that hydrosocialic? And in that, I try to understand alienation. So what does this kind of an infrastructure of surveillance, how does it talk to this kind of a hydrosocial life world? So when I was there, the border was overwhelming. So imagine yourself as a farmer living in say about 20 kilometers away from the border, and you have all your land in the lap of that border. But there, the BSF has put up checkposts. You have to show your documents. So, for just to give an example, you have to give your Aadhaar card, agreement from the, or a statement from the panchayat members saying you are a citizen of India and you have land there and you need to go there to farm. You are given stipulated hours, stipulated days. So it's like a permit regime. And this is a very exploitative, very coercive, and also very inefficient bureaucratization of movement. So here, if you just try to imagine yourself in that kind of a vast landscape where your land could be underwater or it could have emerged, you do not know unless you regularly visit, and you regularly visit the river. Here you have to show papers, documents, go to the land or the river for a few hours, for a few days in a month, without which you cannot access. So increasingly what we see is a criminalization of movement. Increasingly what we see, a criminalization of fluidity of lives, of fluidity of the river, and understanding, a lack of understanding of what riverine lives mean. So for instance, just to give an example of how I went with Rohim, who was my host. He was like, you're going to start your research here, but you must go and seek the blessings of the river, the Podda River, the Gonga Podda, which they call Podda. How can you do research on the Char if you have not taken the blessings of the river? And I completely agreed with him. So I went with him, and of course we went to the BSF checkpost. And I gave my Aadhaar card. I spent 30 minutes explaining to them, but they were like, no, but you're not a member of the village. You don't have land here. We will not let you go. It was almost impossible for me to say, but I'm a citizen of this country, and this land is on the Indian side of the border, and it's not, and it's agricultural land. Everyone should be able to go and come back. And when I was there, I also started generating an understanding of the whimsical nature of these permissions. You can be made you can be given permission, you can be made to come back for 3-4 days. You are allowed to go today, tomorrow you're not allowed to go. And it's almost like a border system that works on permit regimes, that work on a certain permissions that are given or withheld depending on the mood of the security force. And this kind of a calculated inefficiency, so they could say, oh, your permit is, I can't read it, it's stained, or your documents don't, the Xerox is faded out. So this kind of, so I will not give you permission. So this kind of an anxiety that it generates, which is both sensorial as well as an anxiety of belonging. And people who have worked with permit regimes in various parts of the world, including Israel and Palestine, says this is a very calculated method of creating a certain anxiety, a certain despair. And so here you have people who have constantly flowed with the river as it moves, now suddenly being told that you have to prove belonging to a land where they've been living for generations, to be able to access the river, to be able to access your own agricultural land. And we all know that border population has always been deeply stigmatized, deeply criminalized. So this, the fact that they are Muslim settlements, the fact that they're Dalit settlements who are also refugees at some point from the 70s onwards, kind of has also stigmatized these settlements quite a bit. So the stigma associated with the fact they live on Chars, and if you read literature on Chars, Choruas are considered criminals. They are considered a nuisance, primarily because they're nomadic, they're pastoral. Any kind of, I think, pastoral groups are always seen as a threat to belonging, seen as a threat to territorial sovereignty. So in this kind of a framework, how do I understand what this infrastructure of surveillance is? What is the impact of it on people, on riverine communities? And I took from Akhil Bilgrami's understanding of alienation. Of course, there was Marx, and of course, there was others like Rosa Hartman who talks about losing resonance. But I found Akhil Bilgrami's a very short essay on alienation of how alienation is when you start developing a detached assessment of the world rather than being engaged with it, which I thought kind of spoke to my understanding of the riverine communities, because as you know, being engaged with the world or being part of the world, or the very act of becoming or being, where you are constituted by the flows, not just by geological forces, but by the river, by the land, by sedimentation. Whether you should move or not depends more on the levels of sedimentation rather than how ethno-nationalism is being performed at the borders. So now they no longer, so when there is an erosion, with the kind of the conversations that I've had with my respondents was, how do we know that there's an erosion coming? By the cracks in the bank, by the silting of the volume of the silts, the volume of the sedimentation, by looking at the flow of the river, which is an embodied knowledge. It is an intimate knowledge of land and river. It is also an inherited knowledge. And this knowledge now is being interrupted by an understanding of how borders function, about how ethno-nationalism is being performed. So if there's a terrorist attack, in quotes, terrorist attack somewhere in northern India, suddenly you lose access to your lands. You're not being allowed to go to your lands, which is right next to the border. So life becomes one of a calculated assessment of populism, of ethno-nationalism, of border regimes, more than being out there in the world, more than listening to the river, more than understanding soil, of the level, volume of water, of how memory also speaks to us, a memory of displacement that is not necessarily dispossession, but a memory of displacement, or when to move, how, where, and all of that is now suddenly being replaced by a very calculated risk assessment. Like, if the river erodes, shall I get permission from the border security force to be able to go and assess? So this corruption of memory, this casting out of the self from the self. This is what I see as alienation of from their own hydrosocial life worlds. A life world that is built on the rhythms of river, a life world that is constituted by flows, by movement, by being out there in the world, by weathering together, by co-constituting both the river and the humans, how the relationship is co-constituted, to becoming one who is constantly assessing. Do I have the right documents? Do I have my deeds? Do I have the Aadhaar card? Is it updated? Should I need to go to the panchayat member to get a validation of the fact that I'm a citizen of this country? If the panchayat, if there are elections and there are new panchayat members, I have to develop relationships with them, because it's also a question of patronage and power with local self-government. So it is no longer a life that is constituted by the flows, but one that is constituted by certain calculations of where, how and where to move, when to move, depending on the whim of the security forces. And this, I feel, is a casting out of the self from the self itself, and casting out of the self from the land, and producing ourselves, as what scholars have said, is quantified subjects or data subjects who are now, you can measure this subjectivity, you can quantify it, you can say who belongs to where and for how long. A criminalization of mobility, and a privileging of sedentariness. So here you have a Leviathan state that is consolidating the idea that you need to stay put in one place to prove that you belong to this country. You can no longer move with flows and rhythms. So this is what I wanted to speak about. And so of course, it's dispossession, of course, it's injustice, but it's also alienation that one feels when one is asked to kind of deep dive into oneself, and then to produce a subject who is intelligible to the state, intelligible to the security forces. So that act of intelligibility, which needs a corruption of memory, a corruption of knowledge, intimate embodied knowledge, which is also historical, is for me, I think, this adaptability, adapting to the new regimes, the new permit regimes. This is an act of alienation that puts the Chorua or the Chor dweller, that alienates him or her from their hydrosocial life worlds. So this is in a nut what I wanted to speak about today. So yes, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, for your talk. I would now like to request Dr. Ghosh to lead the discussion.
Thank you, Deepak, and thank you, Dr. Ray, for Panchali, in fact, for this amazing conversation. And I read your paper, I really loved it. So I think the fact that it was very effective, that's what, and the fact it was focusing on a lot of embodied experience is something that I really loved. And there was a poetic angle to it, like, in terms of the symbolism that you use, or the writing, the way you write of it, like it stays with you, I think. And that's what something it was like a takeaway from the paper. And I think I was also reading the paper very personally, because I have myself worked on the same framework of hydrosociality, but very different geographical context, that of the urban ghats in Kolkata, and also in the older neighborhoods of Shahjahanabad, but with the hydraulic infrastructures for that matter. But I think I was quite fascinated by the fact that just the fact that using the same conceptual lens, and the fact that Hooghly, or for that matter Podda and Murshidabad, they are very hydrosocial, so to say, but they can produce such different or radically different, subjectivities around it. That's something that I was really fascinated with. And I think one thing that I wanted to sort of also talk to you about is the methodological part of it, in terms of like using the framework. I think a lot of times we get a little swayed away with the sociality of the psychosocial part of it. For instance, like in my case, like in the Ghats of Kolkata, I was like really fascinated with the internal politics of what goes around in the religious and the transport economies, the labor, and the other larger urban political economic forces, so to say. But I think I like the fact that you could, in the writing, and I think that's where the art of writing also, talks about. Like, how you sort of locate it in the border studies, but at the same time you try to reframe the border through what you call this hydrosocial life word. I really love that part of it. And you don't really limit yourself into the very cartographic connotation of the border, so to say, or the geopolitical, there are a lot of peoples who sort of start off from the treaties and everything. You do talk about the security infrastructure, but it's mostly starting, the entry point is that of water, about the erosion, the sediment, and the everyday practice of dwelling. So I think that's really nice, and it sort of attends to that how water generates very different political, ethical worlds and very different geographical context, so to say. And of course, like I think one of the reason why I think that the paper was really timely and relevant was this current political economic context at the whatever is happening across the world, and of course in India particularly with the CA and RC and NPR and the SIR recently. So I think the biggest thing that I would sort of push people to read it in the current context is this paper, is because that ethnography really illustrates that how these kind of policy debates that happen, like, are not limited to just the papers or the newsroom, so to say, but they have very serious implications in terms of how people are experiencing the same revisions on ground. Like, people are made to wait, people are made to feel anxious, there's like a constant fatigue of needing to prove your identity at the same time, and which probably leads to what you are calling like alienation and a lot of sense of unbelonging, so to say. And I think this geography of the chore also becomes very very important here. And I sort of found that the space itself is becoming like a site of resistance, because it's constantly trying to sort of do away with the fixity or the territorial permanence that the border. And I mean, it has been a colonial fetish, but I think later on the modern nation state also tries to impose that fixity on the borders. And this chore sort of in its own way tries to refuse that stability in that sense. And the fact that you I think emphasize that through your anecdotes and narratives, that borders might be politically very violent, very very tense sites, so to say, but ontologically it is a very mismatched position in terms of the fluid landscape or the geography that they're imposed upon. And I think any revision or any policy debate, so to say, should look into all these sensitivities about the geography of it. So, and I think you were sort of reiterating the anecdotes here also while speaking, and in the paper also it comes out very often, like stories of Rahim, your host, and Shaya, about their relationship with the river. And I mean, it's also very philosophical in a way, because I mean, the river is very whimsical, so to say, but at the same time, the way they look at the river, which you were saying, that you can't have any grudge on the river. It's something like, these are the smaller parts that I think I like about the paper. And of course, I think the another anecdote was that of the BSF checkpoint, where the person is made to wait, and the refusal about it, and the need to explain yourself, this humiliation, and the I think that really becomes like the core ethnographic takeaway for the paper. And this bodily experience of experiencing how the alienation really feels like, that's something that I found quite interesting. And I think this sort of brings me to the heart of the paper, that the argument that you put forward is that of the concept of alienation. And you do say, you explain here also in the conversation and also in the paper, that how you want to very consciously sort of move away from the very conventional and familiar languages like dispossession, precarity, injustice, all these things. And I think that's important, because what you are arguing is that the stakes lie in something deeper, like, so to say, like the transformation is not only in terms of the disposition, but rather how people relate to their life world itself. So I think that shift from this living with the river vis-a-vis a living with the proofs or permits is something that was fascinating. But I think I would stop here and sort of provoke you a bit in terms of a couple of curious questions in terms of the conceptual, methodological, and also maybe like slightly curious questions in terms of, like, when you say that uh, alienation is being cast out of one's hydrosocial life world, and it's a shift from that entire life world thing. So I wanted to ask you, like, if you could sort of explain in very simple terms, like, what is this experience of alienation? How is it different from simply being poor, displaced, or being treated unjustly? I mean, I know you have said it in the paper, but I think maybe for the audience, if you could reiterate once, that would be very interesting. And to add on to it is, I think I would ask you to think about, like, if that is the case, if that is the version of the alienation, then what would you count as a non-alienated life in the Nirmal chart? Like, is it just the earlier ability to move with the erosion, the accretion, and the the rhythm of the river, and it's just the proving of the citizenship that is making it even more non-alienated, or what is it? I mean, that's something that I would want you to sort of maybe start off with, and then I will come to the follow-up questions also.
Thanks, Raina. Those are great questions, and they really talk to some of the methodological and conceptual challenges of writing this paper. So, for example, let me start with right away with the alienation as a concept of understanding, because I have struggled with it while writing with the paper. Right, so the alienation, of course, we draw from Marx's work, and he talks about how the worker is alienated from his labor, from nature, and all of that we are very well familiar. And the critique then becomes, what is this essentialized non-alienated life? Is there a non-alienated life, right? And that can become it can become a very essentialist understanding in the context of a choro or a hydrosocial life world, that a very essentialist understanding of what it means to be a choro. And this is going into the path of the unknowable. There's so much we do not know, and there's probably we will never know. And is there any merit in knowing? So that's, I always wonder, there's too much light. We need to dim some of the light sometimes. So when you ask me a question like how do you bring in the lens of alienation, and why is it remarkably different from dispossession or injustice, I think what I was trying to get an understanding of, what does infrastructures of surveillance, or what does securitization of a very porous border do to the lives of people who live with both the border and the river? So it's not like that they had a great time before 2014, or is that so? We know from the 90s itself, there's a lot of shootouts in the borders, there's a lot of incarceration, people are picked up, there's a lot of violence, torture, a lot of gender-based violence that also happens at the border and continues. So it's not like a radical shift that has happened that has completely thrown people out of the thing. But I think what has happened is these sites were also sites which when you started speaking, you said that sites of resistance, these were sites where one could locate subversion of the idea of nationalism, right? In fact, a part of the paper I did write, I think I wrote this, or was it in my research notes that never made it to the paper? I don't know, that nationalism really finds its limits in these kind of muddy, swampy land. It sucks in if you look at the border, the infrastructure, a checkpost, it can just go. Like in 5 days, there can be a flood and the whole infrastructure of the checkpost can collapse. Every border security force there are very rudimentary. The constructed ones are this. So when I was talking to the block development officer, he said, I've often offered to build them a larger, a better infrastructure. And they're like, no, we don't know if it's going to be there in another year. The river just might eat it up. So in that sense, the border, as we understand, it's in its symbolism, is itself in very fluid land. It can be there, it can be gone. So in that sense, border, as we understand, we only understand it as a spectacle, right? We understand the border as it shows up in checkposts, in a fence or a pillar, which can take on significance or not, depending also on the subject's possession. So it's not that there was never any violence around crossing the border, or the India-Bangladesh migration that continued to happen because the river moved to Bangladesh and then to India. So your land could now suddenly emerge in Bangladesh. Your land that is you have. So you went there, farmed, and you came back. And there was a lot of negotiation. So there was an understanding in border security forces that these are riverine communities. They will move with the river. So there was bribes, there was corruption and all of that. But there was an uneasy coexistence that happened. And this also giving space to subvert the idea of a border, giving space to subvert the idea of a national territorial boundary. And it is this collapse of that space, which is not total because it's still a swamp. The river can move and everything can just change and you will not recognize any landscape. But the fact that this kind of securitization of the border has led to an emergence of a boundedness which is no longer negotiable. And I think that is the key to understanding alienation in that sense. So what would a non-alienated way of life be for a Chorua? I'm not sure. I do not know. I do not know if they can tell me either. But what I can get a sense of is that it is an uneasy coexistence with infrastructures, with the river, with a certain ability to negotiate, which is completely getting eroded. And I think that losing that ability to negotiate with the river, they negotiate with the river as well, and to negotiate with all the symbols of nation, is in a way the loss of that ability is what I see as an alienation. And the other part is the question of adaptation. And I didn't really go into it in great details, but with all the noise about climate change and all the technical solutions that are emerging around climate change and all the blame that is being put on climate change to explain away migration, mobility, ecological crisis, capitalism, nationalism, and everything that is creating the crisis is suddenly now put at the foot of climate change. It's climate change that's creating it. And people need to adapt. People need to adapt to climate change. And I said, this question of adapting is a moment of alienation. What do you adapt to? Because you always lived with the river. You always lived with floods. Without floods, the fertility of the land loses fertility. Floods are essential. They are not a crisis. They are they're the precondition for living in those lands. So, but to adapt now, in policymakers' words, to climate change, to infrastructures of surveillance, to a nation that is now insisting on sedentariness, is a moment of alienation where you lose your sense of belonging. I think that was what I was driving to in this paper. It's got its faults, no doubt. It still has a lot of challenges, no doubt. But that's what I was trying to move towards. And that was the methodological kind of understanding that I was trying to frame and conceptualize, that which is why I moved away from injustice and deprivation and precarity, which is the language of climate change policy. That is the language I want to move away from, and more towards something more anthropological language, more understanding of amphibious liminality. Because when you talk about deprivation, when you talk about injustice, you're fixing categories, and I don't want to fix categories, because I think when we fix categories of land and water, of belonging, not belonging, of citizen, alien, migrant, we're automatically giving in to that injustice. We are supporting that kind of a dispossession. But we move to a language which understands liminality as the precondition of life. I think that shift kind of is what helps me to understand hydrosocial life worlds better. And that's one of the reasons why I was driving more towards alienation. And of course, there's a lot of border studies that have happened in the last decade or two that have really extensively spoken about what I have chosen not to speak about. So,
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm totally convinced with the concept of alienation and how it fits into it. It was just to sort of push you to think about how the other way would sort of look like, because I think what was not the scope of the paper, and I sort of, that would have kind of gone a little haywire, because you didn't talk exactly about the kind of contest, negotiations that they would do with the infrastructure itself, like the bribes and the other ways of working around that thing. So I think that would have sort of told you like that it was not like a radical shift what you were talking about. Like it was not that 2014 changed everything, but something remarkable happened in terms of the living with the river, as you were saying. So yeah, I mean, I get it completely. The other one, I think what I was again, a curious question is that because you were doing this field work around, I think 21, you said, so 2021, and that was a period when there was like this uproar around CA and RC and everything. So how did it look like in terms of this fear percolating to the borders? Like were they sort of aware of the that this is something that's a remarkable change that's happening, or is it more about a more like a covert thing that was happening to them, like because of the increasing scrutiny of the papers, of the permits, or how was that change? How did that change look like in 2021 particularly, I think?
Yes. Thank you. Great question. Actually, it's not, I didn't see so much of COVID conversations because these are also out migrating villages. So the people came back, they were all right. And I think in fact, my conversations with ASHA workers brought COVID in more, and what the kind of work they did, and the vaccines, and how people were opposing the vaccine till they realized that, they could not come back to the villages, or they could not out migrate again. That is a conversation. But 2019 and the NRC and the CAA is what I think has led to a very deep anxiety in these borderlands. And these are not just Muslims, these are Dalits also, who are struggling with the idea of citizenship, who have come in from the 70s and the 80s. And so it is a deep-rooted fear there. And that's actually my next paper, is where I'm trying to develop the same research, but taking it to power and patronage, looking at the presence of Trinamool as against the central government, and also looking, and now with the last 6 months, there's been so much of with electoral rolls and all this SIR that has been happening. So it's very volatile. So one of the reasons I'm not being able to write the papers, something new is happening every day, and I'm not being able to put my thoughts together. But the accumulation of documents and the strengthening of a populist party like Trinamool in the borders is a response to the NRC CAA 2019 CAA thing. And I'm trying to develop this idea of how local politics and patronage is strengthening more, because all these papers, as you know, are just actually random chits of paper. The paper only gains strength when someone gives it strength. So every document, every school leaving certificate that they've dropped out of school from class 6, 7, I think even earlier. Maybe they say that to me, but they have always moved with the river. They do not have birth certificates. They have some land rights given to them by the deed is in their grandfather's times, right? So the Dalit refugees have land papers in Bangladesh, which they, by the way, are burning because they're scared that wouldn't prove them as citizens of Bangladesh and they would be deported. So it's a complete chaos that is emerging there. And what it is also doing in many ways is strengthening populist governments. It is strengthening local governments, local panchayat members. It's also a web of politics and patronage that is taking place, which needs a lot more tracking, which needs a lot more understanding. And I think the 2019 brought a remarkable shift, both in the attitude of the border security forces as well as the documentation drive for them as well. So acquiring documents, you've had drives where people have gone and made Aadhaar cards, voting elections, from 2019 to onwards, the local ones, as well as the panchayat elections, as well as the Lok Sabha elections, have taken on a momentum of great significance. Of course, in Bengal, I'm sure you know, elections have always been a very strong thing. People turn out in droves to vote. Women turn out in droves to vote. But this has also taken on a larger significance now. It's just not about voting, but it's also marking your presence as a voter and as a citizen. So what has led to a more active understanding of a citizenship. It has also strengthened the populism of the government in the borders. It has strengthened the hands of the panchayat members. It has led to a lot of corruption. It has led to a lot of inequality. It has gone against landless people who don't have. The main document is the land deeds that they have from their grandfather's times. So landless people, women who have married, marriage migration, women who don't have any access to land documents from their grandfather's times, and single women who've been abandoned or deserted. I mean, they just don't know what's coming their way. So that, of course, I think has created a certain amount of anxiety that we cannot comprehend. The other thing I want to flag here, which I did not write in my paper, and I hope to write about it sometimes, is the challenges I faced as a researcher. coming from a urban Hindu dominant caste background, I'm automatically seen as a spy of the government. People don't want to talk to me. It's been so difficult initially to live in that Char, to work with Char, all kinds of rumors about me being a Christian missionary out to convert people, of being a spy of the government, of being someone who's there to dupe people to make money, all kinds of questions. A lot of, as a single woman working there, I felt there were times when I felt the trauma of it got too much for me. I just had to leave because I cannot take this anymore. So how that ethnographic lens was turned towards on me, on my family, on the reason how I am sitting in a chore where nobody wants to go. How am I doing this research? Where do I come from? So that was, I think, for me, I have not faced this kind of a scrutiny before. So it was my privileges being questioned to a point that actually made this ethnographic study made me deeply aware of where I was coming from. As much as their anxiety, I think my anxiety also erupted on my face. So I thought it was very personal in many ways. It was not a research of, I think the research hierarchies broke down to a point where I had to flee. I just went off for a few weeks. I said, I'm coming back in a few weeks. I need to go back home. So those challenges is something very, very difficult to work with. And the guilt that you also go through when you are a Hindu and a dominant caste member, working with marginalized communities who are facing citizenship challenges, right? With this kind of a disenfranchisement, the guilt that you carry, how do you overcompensate? And these are great things. These are great, what should I say, the turmoil within your heart that kind of just flows into your research in many ways. It changes you as a person so much, right? Yeah. I think I just went off a little bit.
No, no, absolutely. I think that's the reason I think you could empathize more with the anecdotes, and that's how it feels so poetic and very embodied in that sense. And thank you for the reflexive question. I think one of the questions was about the reflexivity as a researcher. So thank you for going into that trajectory. But I was also thinking like because you brought out that issue of guilt, I was thinking like whether you ever had a dilemma of writing about these things which are very sensitive things, right? And given the political context at the moment, the changing context, and you know that no matter how much you try to sort of be more empathetic in terms of writing it, it automatically sort of brings a scrutiny on this thing. Like, okay, because when we write more about it, it just brings
Yes.
back more attention. So, what is that dilemma? I mean, I ask you as a budding researcher in terms of like how do you deal with these
Yes.
dilemmas of things like this when talking about things like this? Yeah.
You're so right, because there's been moments when I'm like, do I even want to write about this anymore? I mean, is it even required at this moment of political crisis to strengthen the state's hand, to bring in the gaze in many ways? But of course, the gaze is already there. It's not like I'm doing anything radically
Yeah.
different. The state knows they're already legible subjects. I mean, one of them, the CAA did that, right? The way they had to go around procuring documents. But I also sometimes I prod myself to saying that it is also a political and ethical imperative to write. I have been given a home in that chore where I stayed with my interlocutor, is the only person who had an extra room in that chore where I could stay. It is his generosity. He didn't know me. I just went, I was looking, trying to figure out what new research could I do. I walked into that village. I was associated with the trade union in rural Bengal, with whose members, the activists I went with. And I just asked this man that, can I stay here? I have a few questions to ask. And I had to explain to him that I'm a researcher. It is also his generosity and his wife Shaya's generosity and everybody else's that I feel that I should write, because they keep telling me that you must write. I hope you're writing. Are you taking down proper notes? And he would like, I want to see what notes you've taken, that you've got the names right. You know the names of the villages. I hope you got the details right, because you really must. So it is in turn driven by them looking at me as someone who could put the word out for them in ways of what is happening and how does the border security work. Every time they speak to me, they know that I'm not here just to have a conversation. I'm here as a researcher. They confuse me as a journalist sometimes, But the suspicion is also there that you're someone who have to report us, you will record and put it up on the media. That suspicion is there, as much as the generosity that I hope you're doing some writing and you're not just, whiling away time. So every time I go back, they said, have you written anything? So it's also for me, I think, as much as I have that dilemma of what am I writing? What am I doing? What implications will this have? I'm also driven by that political thing that there is a generosity that is at work here that I need to work on. And I think somewhere that's every one of us who write, every one of us who do ethnographic research, every one of us who work on the contemporary always face how much to write, what to keep to ourselves, how do I portray it, what is the framework I do, what should I just not speak about, what should I just keep to myself. And it is a challenge. It is a challenge that all of us face. And I don't have an answer, but just to say that I still, budding researcher or a mature researcher, we all are going through the same crisis every time we go to our field, and given the current political times.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I think maybe we can go to the audience. They might have more questions and probably.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Raina and Dr. Panchali Ray. Yeah, any questions from the audience, please? Okay. So you could please unmute yourself and ask your questions. In the meanwhile, Suhasini has asked a question in the chat box. She says, in your study, to what extent did you find Agamben's concept of bare life to be a resonant framework? Conversely, does the shifting riverine nature of the Chars create a dissonance with Agamben's theory by allowing inhabitants to exercise a form of ecological agency that his most static state of exception conception fails to capture?
Absolutely. I think the answer is given. I don't think Agamben's bare life resonates at all with my research. In fact, I think there's a lot of agency, a lot of negotiation. They're not stripped of life. In fact, they're full of life. In fact, sometimes when I would get disillusioned sitting there, I would just get overwhelmed by what is happening. I would get overwhelmed because we would sit in the evenings around the news, the TV, the one TV in the chore, and we would all watch. And they would, the central government and the ministers screaming about infiltrators, about termites in Bengal, etc. And I would just and they would laugh. And they would be like, this is life, and this means nothing, and life goes on. So that I don't think Agamben's bare life or state of exception works very well. There's complete dissonance because these are people who are constantly negotiating, constantly living with the river. I should talk more. I think in my next paper, I probably should do that. Talk more on the agency, talk more on the negotiations, and how full of life these places are. These places that are considered as wastelands in many ways, but they are not. They are the center of the nation. They are the place where all kind of politics are taking place: resistance, subversion to hegemonic politics. So yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Are there any more questions? Yes, just please unmute yourself and ask away.
I have a question.
Yes, Chikasa. All right.
So, so I was wondering, thank you so much for that presentation. I had a very good time listening to it, also to some of the things that Raina said about frameworks and looking at alienation as a concept. I was thinking while you were speaking about sentimental citizenship, this is a work that came out in 2002, actually, George and Marcus, who thinks in terms of political anxiety and connects it as an emotion. I don't think they're calling it emotion. I think they're bringing in the framework of a sentimental citizen and trying to call out a conceptual category of anxiety, political anxiety. And I was wondering I was curious that was that something that you found on your field? That while there is agency, regimes of citizenship or regimes of relations with state create a certain kind of anxiety with respect to papers, with respect to moving back and forth in terms of new regimes that the state brings in terms of governmentality. And was anxiety something? I work on political emotions and found that there are some empirical effective categories on ground when we go in, and we find that they may not always fit in the conceptual categories that we have. So alienation may not always create anxiety. And I was wondering, because was that something that
Yes.
may have been reflected? And because then that also gives us, if I were to put it more mildly, a connecting thread between different regimes and different registers of citizenship. So when you were speaking, I was thinking in terms of tribal populations across the country who are at the receiving end of developmental change. And while there's agency and there are life worlds, ecological life worlds, anxiety kind of colors the empirical reality on the ground. So that is my question.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I did focus on alienation in this paper because that was the lens with which I saw. But the anxiety is probably a very good emotion to describe what is happening with citizenship. And I think this is not incidental, it is calculated. The inefficiency of the bureaucrats, the inefficiency of bureaucracy is a calculation, is a political calculation to create anxiety and despair. And I just feel that if I look, even when I did read literature on Israel Palestine, for instance, it came up to me again and again, this whether you'll be given a work permit or not, whether tomorrow you go back, so you sow and you come back and next day it's been revoked, so your crop is laid to waste. It's just not alienation, of course. It's a very clear economic injustice. It is very clear anxiety, rage, all of those kind of emotions that come, which is also agentic in many ways, right? And I feel that one of the it's just not this political machinery. It's one of the ways the state shows its power. And I'm thinking of the kind of work that has been done around documents. Paper government and government of paper government, or the kind of the power that paper has. I mean, files going. I think Nanika Mathur did some work on that. And what power does paper have over us? And it is how the state makes its presence felt. To be dismissed, that the spelling in your Aadhaar card is not clear, to go back and again to make mistakes, to say that, oh, sorry, Aadhaar cards don't work anymore. Now you bring some other card. Now this document is not working. Oh, the ink on your Xerox has faded out. The power that is constantly shown through documents of the government is making its presence felt at every register. I believe in what I have read from others who worked on the permit regimes, who worked on paper citizenships, is a very calculated bureaucratic move to create anxiety and despair. It's a great political tool. So alienation was for this paper, but yes, you're right. I will push these arguments further when I look at citizenship and I look at bureaucracy more, to understand how and why a certain political subjectivity is created, where you're no longer sure anymore of where you stand, what is happening, and how does this manifest in kind of your election behavior? How does it matter? Sorry, in your voting behavior. Who do you vote for? Why? Do you show up to vote? I think these are all very interconnected. And it's well known that it's always before an election that certain kind of affective momentum is released, whether that's of panic or fear or hatred or anxiety. It's good for politics, all of these affects, right?
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Jigyasa, do you have any follow-up question?
No, thank you.
All right. Thank you. So Pratham has written something in the chat box. He thanks you for your talk, and he has two questions. Number one, how has the destruction of the hydrosocial worlds by large-scale development projects and surveillance regimes altered the intra-community dynamics of the Chars? And the second, despite the enormity of the regime they're against, How do the members of these communities negotiate such precarities on an everyday basis?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question because that was in ways maybe the main thrust of my research, and I need to obviously write more. But yes, the Chars have seen multiple migrations. And coming to your first question first, is these are also Dalit and Muslim communities who are at loggerheads with each other. It's complicated. It's not that they are always at loggerheads with each other. They're also collaborators, because when you live in such an ecologically fragile zone, you need each other. You need each other to inform each other that you've seen erosion happening somewhere, you've seen the volume of water increasing near your field, and that is how people know. So there's a collaboration which is very fragile, which is issue based. There's also antagonism. So it's in anthropology, we have very strong research on all of this, that how kinship and how intimacy is not necessarily a linear one, but one that is deeply contested. Care is contested. You care for your neighbor, even if they're from a different community, but that care is also contested, and it is issue based, and it can turn violent at any given point of time. Also, the other part is ecologically fragile areas have very limited resources. So the fight for control of resources can easily take on communitarian language. It can take on a certain Hindu versus Muslims, Dalit versus Muslims kind of a binary. But what I also understand is that these collaborations that happen, is a contested one. They get together over some issues. They can, when it comes to maybe confronting the local government, they can fight over small petty matters about which land belongs to who, land that has newly emerged. The other part is, of course, there's been multiple migrations, and we've seen a lot of Hindus out-migrate, because this is also the border. They've out-migrated, but they contract out their land to Muslims, farmers, and peasants who continue to live on those. So there is a large political economy that is also at work here. They are also in relations of landlords and contract farming. So even that brings its share of contestations. So it's not just the development infrastructure, that's one part of it. It is also the border and the afterlife of partition. And I feel that the partition continues to resonate in an area like in the Bangladesh border, where there has not been any firm resolution the way that northwestern frontiers have, the northwestern borders have, and how people continue to move up and down, how people continue to remember the wounds of 71 or 80s. It's not 47 for them. I think the wounds of the partition is more of 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is people who are now our age, were little boys who were witnessing all of that, little boys and girls. So I think all of that leads to a certain kind of a contestation. And it is it's not static, it's very difficult to define, it's constantly changing. And of course, the overwhelming mobilization of certain right-wing groups there they were always there, but they're becoming more significant in number. How the wounds of partition are being used to break a Dalit Muslim alliance in the Indo-Bangladesh border. And two of the big thing is, of course, cows and women, interfaith marriages, abduction, more interfaith marriages, which is very common in mixed population and border areas, and of course the smuggling of cows. How these continue to remain very significant affective symbols to kind of create a chasm between the Dalit and Muslim communities who otherwise live in a very contested kind of a relationship. So that's one. Sorry, what is the second question? Oh, yes. Very similar. So, given the normative, one, if you really look at the CAA and if you really look at the special revision that is happening with electoral roads, it's just not Muslims. It's also Hindus who are coming into the same net. So, the anxiety of the Muslim is also the anxiety of the Dalit, because they are both struggling, living on borderlands, struggling with the partition, struggling with migration, having land that is continuously consumed by the river and then belched out. So the range of issue that both these communities face are very similar, right? So they do come together in certain moments. They also part ways in certain moments. So it's also very interesting to see how these collaborations and these contests take place, whether it's again in a small thing like maybe a piece of land that has emerged, to maybe larger registers like who is a citizen of India and who is not, who is an illegal migrant. So yes, it's a mix of all of that.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. There's a question by Sakshi Vadva. I'll just read it out for you. She says, "Hi, thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. I also read about and heard your interesting work at the LASSA conference back in December 2023. So glad to hear from you again. Just wanted to ask one question. You eloquently highlighted the relationship between people living in the Chars and the rivers, as well as the challenges they face in terms of nationalist belonging. However, in the current context where there is increasing discussion and advocacy around the rights of nature, could people living in the Chars be seen as potential custodians of nature? Could their relationship with the river position them as contributors to environmental protection rather than marginal subjects? Dr.
Yeah, thanks for that question, because it's very interesting that you bring it up, because I've also been thinking in terms of that. And I think my research framework goes against this kind of a framing of being custodians of nature, or in fact, marginal subjects. In fact, what I argue is that they are not marginal subjects, or they don't see the river as something that they are in custody of. The river is them. They are the river. So, in fact, a lot of people, anthropologists who work on, and I think there's a disciplinary distinction here, because as anthropologists, environmental anthropologists also, we see weathering as constitutive of being out there. So the river is also not in that sense just an ecological matter. It's also built, because with the river moves. It moves because it has hydrological infrastructure like the Farakka barrage. It has sediment in it. It has sand in it. It has water. It has a lot of waste in it. It has human beings who've lived with it, swam in it. It's also not really a natural, as much natural flow out there. It's not the matter itself is questioned. The whole idea of river as something that is natural and not as much as built as any other built infrastructure is. So I think the basis of this, which is a very advocacy, as you rightfully pointed out, which has a very strong advocacy, policy making orientation to it, which talks about marginal subjectivity, which talks about justice, which talks about rights, is what I'm moving away from. Not that I don't support that has its relevance and it has its value, but my research moves away from that to understand more of life worlds and more of coming together, coming into being together, the river, the human and the non-human, and everything, the soil, the sediment, the sand, the people, the fish, the water, how they are co-constitutive, how do they come into being together, rather than seeing one takes care of the other. There is not a care relationship. I'm sure there is, but that's not where I'm treading. I'm not looking at the relationship between human and non-human as a relationship of care, as a relationship of taking care of rights, of custodianship, but rather how they co-constitute each other, how they weather it out together, how they come into being together. So I think I move away from that kind of judicial, political understanding of river and humans and move more towards an anthropological understanding of how people make sense of their lives, or how lives are built, or how coexistence, which is neither in harmony nor in domination. It's not like the river and the human is in great harmony with each other. They're not. River can be very destructive. It takes away livestock, it destroys homes, it submerges land. So it's not an easy existence, but neither is it of one of domination. And you don't have to dominate the river. You don't have to take care of it. It can take care of itself. All you have to do is, or rather all each of us have to do, is to learn to coexist with them and to come into being with it. I don't know if this explains, kind of is a response So, but yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Yes, Sakshi says it. You have addressed her question. All right. Do we have more questions from the audience? Please feel free to unmute yourself or write in the chat box. No more questions. All right. Then I think we should conclude our talk here. Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for the discussion. Thank you, all participants, for joining. Have a great day. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. It was great meeting all of you. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.